Thank you very much for the kind invitation and beautiful presentation. I decided that my notes are not finished, as the gentleman presented last time, but I realized that with the various languages, maybe it would be helpful for some people to see as I read. So I'm just reading my notes here, but I thought the French helped me a lot to have it on the screen, so maybe it will help you. I do speak German and Italian better than French, so if you have a question, you can ask in any of those languages. This was a project to try and understand really Benjamin in a phenomenological sense. I've been working on a manuscript related to the theses on the philosophy of history, which is also spoken in English as on the concept of history, über den Begriff der Geschichte in German. And I've come to realize that there is a phenomenological basis to his reading of history. And so I'm just really starting to work out this relationship. So this is not a finished project, this is a beginning, but hopefully we can begin a conversation on this topic. So, you know, when we do a comparison between two intellectual figures, can you hear me? Is this okay? Slow enough and clear? So when we do these kind of intellectual comparisons, you know, especially with two figures of considerable weight and independence, there is invariably a certain disadvantage to one over the other. And there really are few existing studies that I was aware of, although I learned of a new one in Italian today. But, you know, beginning with Susan Handelman's book in 1991, there's been only a very few number of attempts to look at that I'm aware of. And if I'm not aware of it, please tell me, but of something I haven't mentioned. But I only know of a few works in the last 20 years. There's Annabelle Herzog in Haifa. There's Asher Horowitz, who I never met, in Toronto. There's someone who's writing in Bogota, I'm not familiar with, Maria Mercedes Andrade. And in Rome, Loreto Ambrosi, I just got to meet for the first time. So many of these fellow travelers have approached from the vantage point of Levinas to Benjamin. And in this, and in several respects, Levinas the younger has been foregrounded to Benjamin the elder. Horowitz, for example, well, no, I'm afraid it's going to have to be. Horowitz, for example, titles his work, his most enjoyable work, How Levinas Taught Me to Read Benjamin, which really speaks to my experience as well to some degree. And there are many sound reasons for reading Benjamin through Levinas. In the studies of Ambrosi, there are good and persuasive indications that Levinas had considered some of Benjamin's questions on history, and in particular the citations that Ambrosi gives from Totality and Infinity are indicative, and I was very persuaded by those. There is also you might be aware of it, but there's also a philological argument to support this view. Levinas's Transcendence of Words, which was cited just a moment before, which appeared in L'Intent Moderne in 1949, is really only a short time before Benjamin's theses on the philosophy of history appeared, which was only about 18 months before in L'Intent Moderne, in a translation that Benjamin prepared himself, and which I've been looking at more for a number of reasons, and that was corrected. The French publication of Benjamin's thesis, the Begriff der Geschichte, so when I say thesis, I'm referring to this text, right? Okay. It occurred many years in French before the German and English publications. Right? Thus, it is rather unlikely that Levinas would have been unaware of Benjamin's work on history. which also served as Benjamin's last philosophical will and testament before taking his life in 1940. It stands to, and so in a certain way, the theses are a very systematic presentation of many of Benjamin's thoughts for his entire work, for his entire, life contribution. And therefore, it makes it extremely difficult to understand. And in another presentation that I gave this morning to the Association Walter Benjamin, I tried to present how for 30 years I feel like I haven't understood this work. Now, in light of the current experience of fascism worldwide, and particularly in the United States that we're experiencing, the text has finally arrived for me. Anyway, it stands to reason in this case that Levinas would have known Benjamin, less probable, however, in the other direction, although not exclusively. And then, as I was thinking about this, I was immediately reminded in this comparison of 2 points of the discussion in Derrida's postcards, which repostulates the order of Socrates and Plato. Do you remember this image with Plato dictating Socrates what he should write? Derrida references this image from a 13th century manuscript of a Benedictine monk, which was taken from the library in Oxford. In the image, Plato is standing behind, Plato stands behind Socrates. Socrates is seated, with Plato extending a strong index finger with his right hand to the center of Socrates' back, and with the left hand, Plato points his other index finger upwards, indicated as if indicating to Socrates what he should write. And Socrates seems harassed in the image. Are you familiar with this image? I maybe I should show it. He has what appears to be multiple hands working at the same time, a vision of Durga, if you're familiar with the Indian god. But here, one hand is being placed into the quill, into the ink pot, while the other hand writes. And Derrida wonders whether there really occurred some kind of reversal of order, and what if Socrates was allowed to speak for himself? So that reminded me of what would it be like if Benjamin was to freely speak of this relationship. What would it sound like? So it would be my hope and my dream, perhaps of a time in the future, to imagine the language of Benjamin in proper engagement with others in this neo-Kantian turn. And so the project today, as I said, is only a very preliminary attempt to propose to rephrase a few of Benjamin's ideas in the pieces in some semblance of the intersubjective orientation to which his writing of history seems to advocate, and would constitute his methodology of articulating a tradition of the oppressed. In his thesis, Benjamin puts forward concepts of materiality, historicism, and time consciousness that shares many of the social phenomenological questions raised by Levinas and otherwise than being. And although I can only sketch a few concepts and approaches in this presentation, rather than attempt a finished examination, the common ground must be a prism of the concept of the social, more specifically in Benjamin's, what he refers to as his epistemic critical approach, and really something that I think is comparable to Levinas's revitalization of phenomenological intersubjectivity. And I'll try and spend a little time on that. There is a noticeable affinity between the approach of both thinkers in the primacy of the social. Perhaps the commonality is this derivative of neo-Kantian, a neo-Kantian turn, which places Levinas, but also Hannah Arendt's work in a phenomenological tradition. Sophie Lloyd has done admirable work in situating Arendt in this context. Han Jonas, just to add one more, would also clearly be included. So if Benjamin were to speak phenomenologically, what would it sound like? In this manuscript on Benjamin that I'm currently working on, I'm interested in the social, sometimes collective orientation in the theses. This seems to me to correspond to his epistemic-critical approach, the methodology established in the preface to the Trauerspiel. In a similar stratum and quality of insight that one also finds in the phenomenology of the first 20th century, Benjamin is oriented towards the observations of the subject that is present in the object which is being observed. This approach with regard to history is meant to articulate the subterranean elements that have been crushed by the dominant conquering forces above surface, but which cannot entirely obliterate those conquered elements of the past. These elements he refers to as the tradition of the oppressed, which his methodology is intended to release from their confinement. And this approach, like all the other works within Benjamin's highly original insights, do not correspond with any other strict usage of the term intersubjective. But I do see a tendency particularly strong in the seventh of Benjamin's theses. There are 18 plus 2 addendums, so 20, if you will, altogether, which concerns the question of whom history supports, with a kind of question that would sound something like this. Is it truly a record only of the history of the conquerors, the dominant history of culture, that originates in violence and dominations, in the documents of barbarism? Or can one read history differently to release a tradition of the oppressed from the historical, cultural fossils of the past, to actualize the return of Rome, which he talks about, to make it viable and a part of our here and now? This type of reading would see the subject, the historian, a part of the object that is being viewed without the reduction of that object to the viewer. I think particularly with Levinas's The Strings and the Wood, on the Jewish reading of the Bible, where the simple reading, I can't remember if he actually articulates the Hebraic term bashat, and the applied meaning or the reading in meaning, darash, of the text is contingent on the reader. At least this part is clear to me, which brings forth the organic, discursive, and social aspects of the text. For Benjamin, texts are also social histories. They are spoken recordings of expression, which are materially human. All texts, therefore, are dialogical, from the telephone book to the ancient cuneiform transactional receipts of Mesopotamia. Texts, and this is now I'm presenting a lot of Benjamin's ideas, which may be, this is a summary. I don't know if this will be successful, but we'll try. Texts anticipate a future reader as they are written, from a textbook to a transactional document. Every written text is an expression between 2 points in a continuum, for which the chronology of that continuum is greater than the numerical sum. This is what Benjamin describes in his second thesis regarding a secret agreement between the generations. And I'll try to give a bit of a phenomenological orientation to this idea. So he says that there's a secret agreement between the generations, which is very odd, right? Because agreements are what you and I do together. We consent to agreements. The only way to see this would be as a basis, phenomenological or ontological arguments about our place in writing texts, right? And our place in reading text. So as readers and writers of text, we are anticipated by the past. We also participate in the material readers to come. This is the nature of our secret agreement, which is an inherent material condition of living our lives in social relations. That inherent material conditionality has an objective status, which is more than merely the history of class relations, or the concept of spirit moving through history. And this is, of course, Benjamin's work. History cannot be totalized in this form without automation, without the chronicler becoming indifferent to the chronicle. In a totally different conception of time, history is revealed in fleeting moments of observation for Benjamin. Fleeting and momentary, and yet they represent an objective, and he talks about heliotropic, the way the sunflower moves towards the sun. Right? He talks about an objective heliotropic directionality that informs every moment. This is understood as a weak messianic force that moves in and through time. Turning to Benjamin's question, with whom does the chronicler of historicism sympathize? The answer is invariably the victor, the conquistador, and yet another interpretation of history is possible. Not historicism is his negative category, right? And the chroniclers of historicism, okay? And so I want to do just a little piece on this often quoted statement that there is no document of culture which is not at the same time a document of barbarism, because I think this is misunderstood. There is an ubiquitous interpretation that initiates a downfall spiral. If there is no document that is not also a form of barbarism, are we not a part of an eternal solipsism of genocide, from victims of genocide to perpetrators of genocide? This is a pessimism that would also invariably correspond to some of the trends of reasoning in contemporary culture on the history of familial violence, the violence within families, right? We learn that the victims of abuse are often later its victors, or alternatively, the privileged class of a given culture is unable to grasp the real conditions of the oppressed class in that culture. But I would put to you, however, that Benjamin is pointing to an entirely different notion of materialism, in which the capacity of consciousness is not dictated strictly by those material conditions, like in that presentation. When Benjamin claims the present artifacts of culture are built upon barbarism, we understand by contrast that the dominant chroniclers of history are the beneficiaries of conquest and feed one another from hand to mouth. When Benjamin argues that there is never a document in culture or history that is not a product of barbarism, he does not mean the document in itself. He means the chroniclers of historicism that have abandoned the material history of objects and blot out the people that have created them. Thus, it is not Benjamin's view that the product of every cultural document is to be rendered a document of barbarism. He means that the dominant history comes to us and is mediated by the historicism of the victors of violence. Yet when we, this is his thesis, participate in an actualization of history, what he understands as material history, also naturally very original and quite different from Marxist political economy or scientific socialism of material history. It's the very inverse of all of that, which is ironic and difficult that he calls it historical materialism. It's a difficult problem. But anyway, we see something else entirely. There is no capitulation to the necessity of violence for the continuation of culture. No Leninism implied here. By discussing cultural barbarism, Benjamin is describing the history of domination in culture, not painting a downward trajectory to the history of liberation. The one form of history suffers spiritual apathy, he says, towards the cultural artifacts, and only see a chronology, not their meaning in time and place. Other form of history sees itself swimming in that same very current of artifacts and detritus from the past, and seeks to make meaning in the past as it arrives in the here and now. It witnesses another tradition within history. If history, and please stop me if I'm going too far.
Yes.
If history can be portrayed as hanging in the balance on the scale between the universal and the particular, writes Benjamin in Thesis 17, then historicism leans on the side marked universal, but an intersubjective reading has a magnetic pull, a heliotropism toward the end, that he elsewhere explains as a messianic approach, an approach which I believe is weak and in a social sense is our participation in the return of Rome. In our understanding of the past also presents the subject and the object. There is no inner magnetism in history that leads each moment towards a universal, what he understands as historicism, in which no element that can be charged or induced towards something greater than the parts. It is merely the addition of the elements of destruction that traverse concurrently in subterranean lives, the history of the conquerors. The materialist writer of history seeks to draw out these parts. But what is crucial? What is crucial for Benjamin in this thesis is not the motion itself, not the returning of Rome, but the return. Not the distance created by the magnetism, but by the magnetic field already present in every object and person that has an ontological position prior to all other considerations. And this is what I hope you will be able to relate to. It always already presents the standpoint of the end of history backwards towards the here and now. The focus is not the motion of thought, but he talks about a dialectics at a standstill, the constellation of stasis that incorporates motion within itself. The term he uses for a constellation of motion and equilibrium is the monad, a non-divisible substance which is indestructible in time and place. Monad cannot be destroyed, it lives on, but it is not always the same, as Levinas argues. Each monad is distinct from another, and each is liable to change in perception, but equally each contains a reflection of the universe within itself, which is alive in its differentiation. The monad is to Benjamin's materialism as the historical object is to the subject from which an entire history can be derived.
Yes, of course.
It is the idea of a constellation that is unique and particular, and therefore is present while being read, but also at the same time as within itself a sign of the end that is a sign of messianic stasis of events. The end is naturally a condition in which, naturally is the right word, but the end is a condition in which events would no longer occur, and thus a final rest to history itself. The Messianic offers a representation of this end, expresses taking the revolutionary chance in any given moment to fight for the extinguished. To take that chance is to help blast a given moment, an epoch at even this very moment as we speak, out of its time, out of the eternal return of the conquerors, and to allow life to be lived outside of its own specific time, as it were, just a single work of art that can be pulled from the entire life work. Through this process, there is a mediation between being just a person, existing in a singular time, and being part of a longer continuum of generations in the tradition of the history of the oppressed. And I'm coming to perfect. The individual action is preserved in its individuated integrity, as part of its own time and place. Yet at the same time, the individual is capitulated out of its own homogeneity or homogeneous particularity and towards something that is greater than its individuated part. Still retaining its interiority, the person is part of an exteriority that for the philosopher, for Benjamin, is the fruit of historical thought. He says its most precious seed. This part really is about a problem in the English translation, so I'll leave that to the side. To some degree, the structure of this inner seed, released from its bad infinity, is at the center of Rosenzweig's Star of Redemption. And I will also maybe leave this at the side. Rosenzweig's Star of Redemption was very important for Benjamin and helped, and it's another connection between Levinas, obviously, and it's the relationship between the universal and the particular that also for Benjamin was extremely important. But I'll leave that, maybe it's too. So let me come to the conclusion. Benjamin writes that to historically articulate the past is the goal, but not as if we could ever represent the past as it actually was. For as it actually was invariably means without ourselves, since the chronicler is never a part of the events of the past in any immediate sense. This presents an inherent contradiction. For every attempt to recall the past anticipates a chronicler, which is the attempt to articulate it as it actually was, and yet the conventional view of how things exist in the past are independent of its history. And so this is arguably the most important contribution to the philosophy, to Benjamin's philosophy of history, and which I think is its phenomenological core. We never call upon something without our presence in that which is being recalled. And our presence cannot deliver the past without peering into it. To historically articulate the past means peering inside to such a degree that we are a part of the object that we're peering into. And that's what I think he means. And yet this explanation is not exactly there. To be sure, I'm not saying we're not surrendering to subjectivity, not at all. Please don't, think that that's what I'm arguing. The world is undoubtedly larger than the world I perceive. However, what I perceive must be recognizable to me in order to understand it, right? If these assumptions are true, it implies that the truth content of the past must have a subjectivity to its object, to its objectivity, a subject that is perceivable to me in the here and now, and therefore must inherently be anticipatable, if that's a word in English. In this respect, there can be no remembrance without presence in the past. But it also follows that the moment that we acknowledge that remembrance requires presence, that particular form of remembrance becomes contested. I'll just read this. Benjamin's approach is contingent on two standpoints, the Aufnahme and the Erfahrung, apprehension and experience. It is an alternative reading, not in the way it is delivered to us by the chroniclers of historicism, those that blot out all experience in order to present it as it really was, but with the notion to present something as it was the past must be actualized. And therefore, as soon as it is presented, it is no longer strictly past. Thus, to present as it really was is in itself an impossibility. The presentation is always the past in a different time position to the thing in itself, and therefore always requires an extension in Kantian terminology. The appearance is not the existence of the essence, it is the appearance of an extension. We know it only through our participation in its recollection. To present history as it really was from these two standpoints means presenting the tradition of the oppressed as if it was taught to us in each moment that it is conveyed. Thank you very much.